Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Imagine a town where secrets never leave the valley, where whispers echo louder than church bells, and where bloodlines twist so tightly they strangle the truth. Tonight, we unravel one of those secrets, a mother who became her own daughter-in-law, a son who became his father's rival, and a child born into a nightmare the world pretended not to see. This is not folklore, not legend. It is a documented history buried in America's forgotten corners. The story begins in isolation. Rural America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was a breeding ground for hidden tragedies. Families tucked into remote hollows, their names erased from census rolls, their lives never captured by headlines. But behind closed doors, these families wrestled with poverty, shame, and desperation. And in one particular household, a bond between a mother and her son would cross the threshold from nurturing to unspeakable. Neighbors recalled the woman as quiet, distant, someone who rarely left her property. Her husband had died early, leaving her with children to raise and no support system. The son, barely more than a boy when his father passed, grew into her confidant, her protector, and eventually the only man in her life. When whispers first began, they were dismissed as cruel gossip. After all, who could believe that a mother would take her own child as a husband? But whispers have a way of solidifying into evidence. Records surfaced, birth certificates with missing fathers' names, children whose faces carried uncanny similarities to both mother and son. And by the time truth clawed its way into daylight, it was too late to undo the damage. She was already pregnant, carrying the child of her own son. This isn't just a story of broken morality. It's a story of loneliness, of psychological collapse, of what happens when human beings are sealed off from the world until their own bloodlines become prisons. The real horror isn't only what they did, it's how it was hidden, and how entire towns colluded in silence, preferring shame to exposure. What you're about to hear is a story that history buried, a story your grandfather might have heard in whispers but never dared repeat. To understand how such a forbidden bond could form, you have to step inside the world they lived in. This wasn't the America of bustling cities, of opportunity and open roads. This was the America of isolation, forgotten valleys where time seemed to stop, where the nearest neighbor was a mile away, and where poverty wrapped around families like a noose. In places like this, survival came first. Reputation, morality, even the law, those were distant luxuries. The mother at the center of this story had been left a widow at a fragile age. Her husband's sudden death shattered the only stability she had ever known. With no income, no extended family willing to help, and no education to fall back on, she became a woman adrift, and in her loneliness, she leaned on the one person she had left, her son. He was her companion at the table, her partner in chores, the one who protected her from the cruel whispers of townsfolk who pitied her but never helped. Day by day, the line between parent and child began to blur. The son, now entering manhood, had no one else to model intimacy, affection, or loyalty. He had seen his father's love vanish too soon, and in its absence, he clung to the only woman in his world. What began as comfort slowly twisted into dependency. What began as innocent closeness morphed into something neither dared to name aloud. When the first signs of their relationship emerged, the town reacted in silence. Some suspected, some knew. But in rural America, scandal was managed not by exposure, but by secrecy. Churches preached forgiveness, not justice. Families protected their own, even when the truth festered like a wound. And so the relationship grew unchecked, shielded by walls of shame and fear. It was in this environment that the unthinkable happened. She conceived, a mother carrying her son's child. To some, this was proof of moral collapse. To others, it wound as simply the tragic result of isolation, of lives so cut off from the outside world that reality itself warped. The baby became the embodiment of silence, a child who should not have existed, yet whose very birth testified to the darkness thriving in hidden corners of America. The haunting question remains, was this a crime of will or a crime of circumstance? Was she a predator, or was she simply broken by loss and trapped in a cycle no one dared to interrupt? History offers no easy answers, only fragments of testimony, faded documents, and the lingering unease of a story that refuses to rest. The birth of the child did not end the whispers, it magnified them. Neighbors noticed the strange silences, the way visitors were kept at arm's length, the way the family avoided gatherings where questions might be asked. Children in the community whispered cruel nicknames behind closed doors. Adults looked the other way, convincing themselves it was none of their business. In places like this, truth was not exposed. It was buried, layer upon layer, until no one dared dig it up. The child herself bore the mark of that secrecy. In photographs that survived, you can see the features. Eyes that seemed too familiar, a resemblance so sharp it unsettled anyone who knew the family. She grew up in a household where her brother was also her father, where her grandmother was also her mother. These contradictions were never spoken aloud, but they hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. What's chilling is how ordinary life seemed to continue. Chores were done, meals were cooked, the seasons turned. On the surface, it was just another struggling family in rural America. But beneath that surface, identities had collapsed into one another. Family roles blurred until they no longer made sense. When outsiders did ask questions, the answers were evasive. A missing father was blamed on death or abandonment or simply none of your concern. And yet, even silence leaves evidence. Court records decades later hinted at disputes over inheritance, disputes that revealed shocking family structures. Documents from county clerks listed fathers' names as unknown or left entire sections blank. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate omissions, designed to shield the truth but instead leaving a paper trail of absence. For the child, growing up meant inheriting not only poverty, but also a legacy of confusion. Imagine being told to respect a man who was both your brother and your father. Imagine being disciplined by a woman who was both your mother and your grandmother. These are roles that human psychology cannot reconcile. And so the trauma seeped into every corner of life, shaping identity, shaping behavior, shaping how future generations would understand themselves. What makes this story even more disturbing is that it wasn't unique. Across Appalachia, across forgotten pockets of the Midwest and South, similar stories whispered through the hills. Families cut off from the outside world, turning inward, repeating patterns of secrecy until generations were bound by the same silence. This woman and her son were not alone. They were part of a darker, hidden history that America has always tried to forget. By the time the second generation grew older, the damage was undeniable. The child of mother and son carried not only the burden of secrecy, but also the marks of a genetic trap. Illnesses lingered. Development was uneven. There were whispers of odd behaviors, of learning struggles, of a child who never quite fit in with the others. In small towns, children are rarely left alone, yet this one often was. No birthday parties, no school friends, no chance to escape the legacy written into her very blood. The mother aged quickly, her face weathered not only by hard labor, but by the crushing weight of her choices. Neighbors described her as haunted, avoiding their eyes, speaking in half-sentences, retreating deeper into her home as though the walls might shield her from judgment. The son, too, was marked. He carried himself with an air of anger, a defensiveness that flared when anyone questioned him too closely. In photographs, few as they are, you see a man whose youth seems stolen, whose eyes reveal both guilt and defiance. But the most haunting detail is this: the cycle did not stop. The girl, confused by the broken structure of her family, grew into womanhood without a clear sense of boundaries. In communities like these, patterns repeat themselves. and whispers suggest that what began between mother and son echoed into the next generation. If true, the child became both the product of inbreeding and the next participant in it, a cycle feeding on itself, each generation folding inward. The town knew, people always know, but admitting knowledge meant admitting complicity. To acknowledge what was happening on that property was to confront the fact that entire communities sometimes protect shame instead of stopping harm. Silence became the safest choice, and so the house stood there, year after year, like a scar on the landscape, its curtains drawn, its secrets festering, its walls absorbing the weight of things no one dared speak aloud. And when outsiders passed through, they saw nothing unusual, just another weathered farmhouse with smoke curling from the chimney. They never knew that behind those walls, a family tree had twisted so violently it had become unrecognizable. What looked like a home was, in truth, a prison, one where generations were trapped in a nightmare they did not choose, yet could not escape. The further we dig into this story, the more unsettling it becomes, because the truth didn't just remain inside that one house, it seeped into the memory of the entire town, staining it in ways no one dared admit. For decades, people carried fragments of the story, whispered across kitchen tables or in hushed tones on church steps. They spoke of the strange girl who never seemed to belong, of the boy who grew into manhood too quickly, of the mother who aged before her time. And yet, when outsiders asked questions, the town became a wall of silence. This silence is what makes stories like these so haunting. It's not simply that forbidden acts occurred, it's that whole communities chose to keep them buried. Teachers marked attendance without asking too many questions. Doctors treated ailments but avoided uncomfortable truths. Neighbors brought food during hard winters but never crossed the threshold to see what was happening inside. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one dared be the one to expose it. And this silence had consequences. The child grew up in confusion, shaped by a world where words like mother, father, sister, and brother meant nothing solid. The normal compass of family life was shattered. And without that compass, she wandered into adulthood already carrying a fractured identity. The weight of secrecy can be heavier than poverty itself. Poverty ends when money comes in. Secrecy festers for generations. The story begins to feel less like a scandal and more like a haunting, because once you learn it, you realize how many layers of American history are built on silence. How many families hid their truths in barns, in cellars, in the gaps between census years. How many towns decided it was easier to ignore than to confront. And how many children paid the price for sins they never committed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent like the town, or would you have dragged the truth into daylight no matter how much it burned? The reality is, silence protects the guilty, not the innocent. And in this case, silence ensured the cycle would never truly end. As time moved on, the scars of this family deepened. The child of mother and son grew into adulthood, marked by confusion and an identity split down the middle. Every relationship she tried to form was shadowed by the twisted roots of her upbringing. Neighbors described her as distant, withdrawn, and sometimes erratic. It was as if she carried not only her own trauma, but the unspoken sins of her parents. She was born into a legacy she never asked for, a legacy that distorted her sense of who she was and where she belonged. And for the mother, the torment was unrelenting. She could never escape the sight of her son, because he was not only her son, but also the man she had taken as husband. She could never hold her grandchild, because that child was also her daughter. The very roles that anchor family life had collapsed on themselves, leaving her with no ground to stand on. Each day was a reminder of what had been done, and what could never be undone. For the son, the weight of it all transformed into bitterness. He lashed out at neighbors, fought with men at local gatherings, and carried an air of anger wherever he went. He lived in defiance, but beneath that defiance was shame, a shame that could never be spoken. Some say he drank heavily, others say he withdrew entirely, refusing to leave the property except when necessary. Whatever the truth, his life was marked not by freedom, but by the invisible chains of a choice he could never escape. The most unsettling truth is that the story didn't die with them. Whispers suggest the girl carried the pattern forward, repeating in her own life what had been forced upon her. Whether by confusion, coercion, or sheer inevitability, the cycle seemed destined to echo. The family tree, already twisted, folded inward again, generations layered with shame, each one born into a house where silence was stronger than love and secrecy more enduring than truth. And the town, still, it said nothing. The farmhouse eventually decayed, its wood rotting, its roof collapsing, its fields turning wild. But for those who lived nearby, the sight of that ruin was a reminder. They knew what had happened there. They chose to let it fade into history rather than confront what it said about them, about their own silence, about the darkness that had lived in their midst. Today, all that remains of their story are fragments, old records tucked away in county courthouses, faded photographs in forgotten albums, and the crumbling remains of a house that once hid more than it ever revealed. To passers-by, it is only a ruin, another relic of America's rural decay. But for those who know the truth, it is a tombstone, a grave marker, not for a single life, but for an entire bloodline swallowed by secrecy. What makes this story so disturbing is not just the act itself, it is the silence that surrounded it. The mother, the son, the child, all became trapped in roles they never fully chose, locked inside a cycle that the outside world could have broken, but never did. And in that silence, generations suffered. The scars of incest are not just physical, they are psychological, spiritual, and eternal. They warp identity, blur memory, and leave descendants with questions they cannot answer. If you listen closely, you realize this is not only their story, it is part of a much larger history, one America has always tried to bury. From Appalachia to the Midwest, from deep hollows to isolated farms, these stories exist like shadows. They are not taught in schools. They are not celebrated in folklore. They are whispered, hidden, denied, because to face them is to face the uncomfortable truth that isolation, poverty, and silence create monsters, not mythical ones, but human ones. And so the story of a mother who married her own son and bore his child lives on, not as gossip, but as warning. A reminder of what happens when communities look away, when secrecy is chosen over truth, when shame is protected more fiercely than the innocent. The farmhouse may be gone, the family name erased, but the lesson remains carved into the fabric of forgotten America. As you sit with this story, ask yourself, how many more are out there? How many families erased their own past, or to protect their names, and how many secrets still lie waiting to be uncovered in the places history forgot? Thank you for watching. If you found this story haunting, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who thinks they know America's history. Because the past is never as far away as we'd like to believe. Sometimes it's right behind the curtain, waiting to be seen.